Hello, hardcover hooligans. Welcome back for another episode of Hardcover Hooligans. I'm Danilo. I'm joined with Mac, and I have a question for him.
I love to answer questions.
If you could rewrite a book that already exists, which one would it be?
The novelization of Revenge of the Sith.
And that would net you a Nobel Prize, I think.
You know, it's pretty good, It has some stuff about Anakin when he's turning into Darth Vader, some stuff that the film does not highlight because it's inner monologue type stuff.
Now, would it be more interesting that you wrote it now in this year that we're in than it would be that it came out right after the movie came out?
It's interesting that you say that. Revenge of the Sith is in theaters right now as we're recording this, and I'm seeing it on Tuesday. I have not seen it yet. I mean, I've seen the movie, obviously, but it is very hard to watch now with the current political climate,
Oh, that's
right.
So
perhaps somebody might look at me and be like, well, of course, his is certainly more informed by the current politics of the moment, therefore is better. I think I would struggle to perfectly replicate some pages for whatever reason, though, or some chapters.
Yes, Revenge of the Sith is less interesting than during the Bush administration, more interesting than
Yes.
the Trump administration.
Yes,
and that is
exactly
what the short story is about, basically.
Yeah, this shit is awesome. This is such a
We
bad
are
word.
reading a short story by Jorge Luis Borges. We've read one of his other stories on this podcast before called The Library of Babel. If you haven't listened to that, go listen to it. Or not. We'll probably do some compare and contrasting. There's some similar themes in this, I believe. This story was first published in 1939.
I didn't know that.
Which is crazy, and it is about just like the last time we could summarize the story in one sentence.
Yeah.
And then the rest of this is we'll talk about the random funny stuff, because I think more so than Library of Babel and some of the other ones, this one is just kind of funny.
Yeah, it is funny. I think it's
sort
definitely
of like one long joke, basically.
Yeah.
Like a literature joke.
And it's, I think, there's some critique in there of
totally.
maybe some reviewers and literary analysts, but yes, it is very funny.
And like questions about like authorship and context. I think it's, yeah.
If you didn't know, like if you showed this to somebody in 9th grade, they would think this is just real. And that's not a knock on some dude in 9th grade. I'm just saying it does take some sort of like, you have to be in the know,
I think you sort of have to like, if you take a college level English class, you'll get this. But yes, I think that's like the prereq. You need to read a bullshit article on a novel in like a journal, and then you'll get this, because you read that and you're like, come on, guys. So it's are reading. Have I even said the title of the story? The story is called Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. And I couldn't think of a Menards joke, but I'm just going to put that out there because I think it's very funny. Menards, the hardware store.
Something there. If you think of it, you can send us an email.
Something. If I make a screw, is it more interesting to sell it at a Menards than Home Depot?
Nice.
I don't know.
That's really good.
There's something there.
Yeah, there might be something there.
Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote / handyman.
Yeah, there you go. That's good.
Something. So this story, quote unquote, it's not a story. It's like a fictional book review by an unnamed author, and he is defending his literary friend, a Frenchman by the name of Pierre Menard, and Pierre Menard tries to do something kind of interesting. And he tries to rewrite a book that already exists,
and
which
not
is very
just
funny.
Rewriting it, steeping himself in the minutia and the detail, and recreating it.
He's like recreating it word for word. And so the author of this book review first starts out by being like, okay, so what are my qualifications for defending this?
I know, it's so good.
He starts out, he's like, so I'm going to be defending this guy, and I have had some people read this article and they can vouch for how accurate and good it is. One is this lady, who like the Countess of Bachelier or something. Yes. And then there's like another countess, and it becomes more and more clear that like they are like his sponsors, and he wrote like some flattering poetry about them, and so like the fact that they vouch for him means nothing.
And he keeps bringing up in defense, he's like, Henri Bachelier actually thinks this is awesome. And he's like, okay, I don't care.
It's so funny. Well, because later he's like, I wrote a collection of flattering poetry for her at one point. And so you're like, of course she won't like you. He makes a list of Pierre Menard's works. He's like, I've analyzed all his stuff, and it's like a partial translation of this, a treatise in which like an argument that the game of chess would be much more interesting without one of the rook pawns. Wait, I want to find this. This verbatim. It's so funny.
Well, I have one here. A handwritten list of lines of poetry that owe their excellence to punctuation. Huh?
Oh, a technical article on the possibility of enriching the game of chess by eliminating one of the rook's pawns. Menard proposes, recommends, debates, and finally rejects this innovation.
This innovation.
And it's like he's making up stuff. He's referencing other things. It's not... None of it like means anything. It's like an introduction to the Italian translation of like this Latin pamphlet. Like he clearly hasn't like created anything original or novel, but the writer of this review... Can you hear the dog in the background squeaking?
I can.
Okay. I'm going to go remove that from the dog's mouth.
Well, maybe he'll keep this in. I don't know. Danilo edits the podcast. He'll hear this when he's recording. I just want to let you know, Danilo, that I think you're a really smart and handsome guy, and I love doing the show with you. Thanks, Danilo.
Okay, I'm back.
Yep, Danilo just went to go put down his dog, and now we are back doing the show.
Phew, thank God, right?
But he says that he says that's the full extent of his work, the visible work, and he's like, oh, it's such a shame that his oeuvre remains unfinished. He curses our human limitations. And his greatest work, his magnum opus, is a line-for-line recreation of the 9th and 38th chapters of Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote and a fragment of chapter 22. So that's not the whole book.
No, but the reviewer, the author, elucidates on this, and he talks about the process, and like when Pierre Menard came to him and was like, so I want to do this to see if it's possible for me to recreate this text line by line. Let me see if I can find a quote. He says, initially, Menard's method was to be relatively simple: learn Spanish, return to Catholicism, fight against the Moor or Turk, forget the history of Europe from 1602 to 1918, be Miguel de Cervantes. Pierre Menard weighed that course, but he discarded it as too easy. So he thought, like, so if I became the author, then I could write it. And he's like,
no, that's too easy.
What? You know what would be more interesting? Because if I became Miguel de Cervantes and wrote Don Quixote, that's not interesting at all, because Miguel de Cervantes wrote Don Quixote.
Right, he already wrote it.
What if I was Pierre Menard and Pierre Menard wrote Don Quixote? How interesting would that be? And the author, like through the experiences of Pierre Menard, like that's just such an infinitely richer text.
Because he doesn't want to compose, there's a quote, another Quixote, which is surely easy enough. He wanted to compose the Quixote.
I think at this point we should mention that like the importance of Don Quixote, especially in like Spanish speaking literature. Like, sure, it's really important. Everyone talks about like English speaking literature, but like in Spanish speaking literature, it is like the text. Like to write that is like to write the Bible, basically. And the story makes fun of this too, because he's like, it'd be so boring for Oh, I want to find the quote. It's so funny. Composing the Quixote in the early 17th century was a reasonable, necessary, perhaps even inevitable undertaking. In the early 20th, it is virtually impossible. Not for nothing have 300 years elapsed, freighted with the most complex events. Among those events, to mention but one, is the Quixote itself. He's like, it's more interesting to create it now in a world where it already exists. Like,
right. Who would do that? Who would imagine would do
How
such
interesting.
A thing? He also
what would this
wrote
reveal about our culture?
He wrote 2 chapters, and they're not even the beginning. He's just
like
he picked 2 chapters.
Oh, there's a funny sideline. When I read this, like, and I think I read it in high school for the first time. This story, I think I like missed the joke part of it. I thought like, oh, this is an interesting like metaphysical problem because like at its core, it sort of is. I'm like, wow, what an interesting like achievement or like a thing to think about. And I really took this on the same level as the Tower of Babel and totally missed like how funny and absurd it is.
Yeah, it's also like I think it can be read to have like an imperialist bent. Like, totally. This French or this white Frenchman could do a much better job because he's not living in the like quote unquote savage times of Spain back then. No. He is in a civilized era now, and he can writing it knowing all that stuff. Being much smarter than Cervantes, he can bring new life into Quixote, and yet he struggles and only completes 2 chapters and then dies.
And there's a lot of French in this story in like
there
really
is
funny
a
way, like a lot of
it.
random phrases in italics. I mean, I'm gonna be very pretentious here. I speak French, so it didn't have a big issue for me. How was that experience for you?
Well, for me, I think
part of the intention is to be like, what? Like you don't understand that part of it.
Yeah. Well, I think it is frustrating. It's so pretentious, and so that's just sort of how you take it. He keeps bringing up. Well, like we already said, he keeps bringing up Henri Bachelier or whatever his name is as like look at like my credentials here, and it makes it. You could read this that it's like battering you over the head that the person writing this is not has no care at all for the original language. Like it's gonna make you understand that by having a ton of this be weirdly in French, not like paragraphs or anything, but like every text referenced, every he says he's like, instead of saying his let me find it here, instead of saying his like it's a souvenir album, he calls it like album des souvenirs. Like it's like, okay.
Yeah, there's a ton of that where like you could just say the normal word, but he like makes it in French. He talks about like how it's how him writing it in the 20th century is like more interesting because it's more subtle. He's like, if you read it like in the original, then like it's just a very typical, like, this idea makes sense because Cervantes used to be a soldier. But, like, the fact that Pierre Menard wrote this and he was, like, a Frenchman with no ties to the military, or, like, the fact that a Frenchman wrote this and there is, like, it becomes a historical novel if Pierre Menard wrote it. But, like, it doesn't have the trappings of a historical novel. So it makes it a really good historical novel because it doesn't have all the cliches of a historical novel.
That is so funny. It's also insane. We talked about it in the last episode about I almost called him Pierre Menard, Borges sort of predicting the way we would communicate in the future with the internet. It's so funny that this is fucking RoboCop 2015 compared to like Verhoeven's like 80s
right,
version.
Exactly. Remakes of remakes.
Yeah, it's just taken to its like hilarious idea where it would be literally shot for shot the same movie with the same actors in the same location, and it's
well, it's like Disney doing Snow White and like doing Snow White in this political climate.
Right. It's
like
brave. Okay. Yeah, it's so good. And also, this is important. The author of this book now reads Don Quixote as if Pierre Menard finished it. There's like a section where he says, like,
this is a new realm of literary criticism.
Right. He says, shall I confess that I often imagine he did complete it, and that I read the Quixote, the entire Quixote, as if Menard had conceived it? A few nights ago, I was leafing through chapter 26, parentheses, never attempted by Menard. I recognized our friend's style, could almost hear his voice in this marvelous phrase, the nymphs of the river, the moist and grieving echo. Okay, he didn't write it. Like, that's not Pierre Menard, and even if it was, it still wasn't.
Pierre Menard. Well, and I think there's something so interesting about choosing Don Quixote as like this book that's been like such, especially in the Spanish-speaking world, like done to death. Every line has had dissertations written about it, and like the only way to like interact with it in a new way is like to pretend a different person had written it, because everything else has been said about it, so you have to like invent a new context for this novel or to have something original to say about it, even though that's like patently an absurd thing to do.
It makes me wonder if death of the author and all that, but it makes me wonder if at the time he was like there was like a resurgence when he was writing this of like Don Quixote analysis, and he was like, there's nothing left to say, shut up, there's like other books we can be talking about. I don't know if that's the case, but it certainly seems like a man very frustrated. This and Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal sort of sit in the same realm in my mind of like a guy super pissed at whatever's going on, so you write like a big long funny joke about it to like piss people off. I can imagine this coming out and people being pissed. Like, okay, well obviously he's talking about me. Like, I mean, definitely. Like, it's
also gotten any more relevant with any sort of literary criticism, because like what else is there to say about anything that has any sense? Like, I was a huge English nerd, was at some point considering doing like a master's or a PhD in English literature, and like, talking to my professors about it. And it really, like, the stuff you'd have to like write, because you get so specialized to the point where it means nothing to anyone except you, because you're the only person who knows that much about that one thing. And then like, what's the point, right? And this is sort of making fun of that, is like what sort of things you have to analyze or create or like alter in order to have some original opinion about something, but that ultimately doesn't mean anything, because
who's it for?
Right, exactly.
This is nothing.
I want to read the section where he like has the two identical sentences right next to each other.
Oh yes, yeah.
So he says the Cervantes text and the Menard text are verbally identical, but the second is almost infinitely richer. The revelation to compare the Don Quixote of Pierre Menard with that of Miguel de Cervantes. Cervantes, for example, wrote the following, Part 1, Chapter 9. Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and the future's counselor. And then back to the analysis. This catalog of attributes, written in the 17th century and written by the ingenious layman Miguel de Cervantes, is mere rhetorical praise of history. Menard, on the other hand, writes, Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and the future's counselor. And then goes back to his analysis, and he says, history, the mother of truth. The idea is staggering. And he just goes on to analyze the exact same sentence through the different lens.
Menard has perhaps unwittingly enriched the slow and rudimentary art of reading by means of a new technique. The technique of deliberate anachronism and fallacious attribution. It requires, like you said, infinite patience and concentration. Encourage us to read the Odyssey as though it came after the Aeneid.
Oh yeah, he talks about like this is a new way to think books, like, or to read books. Like we can just read and pretend someone else wrote them, and then talk
or they came out at different times,
and then talk about that. Like, what is it to say that the Aeneid came or the Odyssey came after the Aeneid? How interesting!
It's the ultimate like, It's the ultimate like we can all get in a room and circle jerk about this instead. This new idea.
And the best part, he says, this technique fills the calmest books with adventure.
He also calls it the final Quixote. He's like, this is it. It's perfect. This thing that also doesn't exist yet because there's only two chapters
and a fragment of another chapter.
He says, I think Pierre Menard says it was too hard. He's like, some of it was way too hard to redo. It's like, oh, it's not. It's the same.
When he talks about his
word for
process,
word.
he like had pages and pages of it scribbled out and crossed off, and he like go to the town square to like burn all his notes. He's like, it's not right. It's not right.
Yeah, it's really good. It's very fun to read this and think about, I think of all of the pretentious arts, I think certainly literature and the study of English can lend itself to being pretentious the most in the way we talk about things. And this is the ultimate, this is like that idea taken to the extreme, obviously. Mm-hmm. And it's fun to see, I'll read a fucking New York Times article about a book and it's like, oh my God, like, you don't, it can be so frustrating. And it's nice to know that this was happening back then.
Like written reviews of like albums of like music albums.
Oh my God.
Read a Pitchfork review, like it makes you want to shoot yourself in the head.
Pitchfork especially, yeah. So pretentious. And it's nice to know like he was dealing with that like fucking 100 years ago.
We talked when we read Library of Babel about, Borges' interest in like how language justifies, like how humans use language to like justify themselves and meaning. And I think this is like another realm of that. Like the author of this text is trying so hard to like justify himself and his place in the literary world, and also Pierre Menard's, like through these these like appeals to authority of people that don't matter, like this list of works that like are not important, and the fact that his magnum opus is just a copy of a book that already exists, but like that makes it more interesting somehow. It's also go for it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say you could totally imagine this being real. Like you walk into a bookstore. Don Quixote as written by somebody else. And reviewers being like, it's actually really interesting the way that,
because like reviewers and stuff have to like justify their own existence and all their own stuff. I also think it's, I wrote Pierre Menard, the literature's first AI prompt writer, which is basically what he like. This is what an AI prompt writer would write to justify their existence.
Yeah, because this is what it does. This is literally, if you don't know, this is what a large language model AI does, generative AI does, is just pull from shit that exists already. It's not always verbatim from one thing, but it might as well be. It's just verbatim from other things stitched together, and that's this. I mean, Pierre Menard...
and then the people who like sit on the backs of that and like pretend that it's like interesting and deep work that no one else can do because like I'm crafting these prompts to get exactly what we want from.
You can ask ChatGPT to write Don Quixote, and then you can write an article about how it's interesting that the AI, that this robot was able to come up with the same sort of dialogue that the beautiful phrase, the water nymph or whatever it is that Cervantes
and you know
was
what?
able to do.
You just said
then.
that is not an uninteresting paper to read.
No, I know. It's just you have to come at it from not the way that the narrator of this story comes at it, and it's like
ego
this is
gratification.
The Quixote. Like this is way fucking better than that Drek written by that Spanish guy. Like who cares about that? That guy who's served in this war, it ruined it. It tainted the work because it's violent and he doesn't understand what he was talking about. But Pierre Menard, a guy who wrote, let's see,
no books.
A study of the essential metrical rules of French prose, knows way more about Don Quixote than the guy who wrote it.
One of Pierre Menard's books is like he basically like reversified like some of another poet's sonnets, and that's like said as like a different. It's like a whole other work. You just rearrange some guy's words.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, I don't really know how much more I have to say about Pierre Menard, author of Quixote, but this is a really good one. This is very short, so if you should definitely read it.
I mean, I think like we said, AI authorship, like who, like if you are a cop, like because all AI does is copy things, and so like who owns the copy and what does it mean?
Right.
And it's also like the craziness of the world where like we've created a system where like this same justification for like AI copying other people like is used. They're like, oh, it's unique because it's a combination of other things, or like it created it by itself, therefore it's not a copy, therefore anyone can own it. It's the exact same argument that the writer of this is making about Pierre Menard, which I think is, again, crazy that how relevant this is, especially in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's so stupid. Just imagining if this was... I mean, I say imagining. We just said it is fucking real. It's so frustrating.
People have been sick of trash, garbage writing for 75 years. It's only gotten worse.
I much prefer this, or like, if you're gonna... it's like
at least ostensibly this guy wrote it himself.
I know, and at least whether or not he was a pretentious freak about it and an idiot, he was anguished over the dialogue, and he was a person who wrote other things.
Or like it's crazy that the bottom of the barrel is like, at least a human did this to boost their own ego. Like, you can't even say that about some of the things being created.
Well, there's this line in it that I think is insane. I'm just going to read the paragraph. This is, I think, something that Menard wrote him. He says, "Thinking, meditating, imagining are not anomalous acts. They are the normal respiration of the intelligence. To glorify the occasional exercise of that function, to treasure beyond price ancient and foreign thoughts, to recall with incredulous awe what some Doctor Universalis thought, is to confess our own languor, our own barbarity. Every man should be capable of all ideas, and I believe that in the future he shall be." That is ChatGPT.
That's crazy.
Yep.
Anyone can make a Studio Ghibli movie.
Yep, and it will be shitty, even if it can somehow manage to be a perfect shot-for-shot recreation. What the fuck is the point?
That is our right as thinking beings to own everything.
Yep, every man should be capable of all ideas. The homogeneity of thought is a good thing, actually. Everybody should be the exact same. AI
awesome.
Slop. I love you, Borges. Unless you're, I think awesome. He said some crazy stuff about slaves, but other than that, he
had a complicated relationship with fascism, so but that's fine.
He did.
But he was in Argentina. What can you do?
These stories. The stories are what just I would love to find more more shit like this out here. People who live fucking life and write about it. Not to sound, pretentious myself, but it's just I like a surreal author. I think that's my favorite kind of author. Surreal or military science fiction.
I either want an infinite labyrinth of books, or I want fucking robots blasting aliens.
Hell yeah, I do. Hell yeah. I contain multitudes. I am capable of all ideas, goddammit. Pierre Menard said so.
Now, I'm the same way, except military science fiction. I like military fantasy. I want battle mages on the front lines.
Hell yeah. Man, maybe I lied, I think last episode you asked if I could... Or no, it was this. If I could find a book or recreate a book, I would want to find Borges' lost military fantasy novel. Can you imagine that?
That would be awesome.
That would be awesome.
Well, I hope everyone else goes and learns Spanish and returns to Catholicism and writes their own Quixote. If you find a Moor or a Turk, maybe don't fight them.
No, yeah, don't, because it will inform your version of the Quixote much better than Spanish warriors.
Now, do you think if two white male podcasters wrote the Quixote, that is in some way more interesting?
I don't think it's in some way more interesting. I think it's in all ways way better and more interesting and cooler and sexier and funnier.
I think in many ways this episode is the final Quixote.
We have created our own Sancho Panza through this dialogue today, and it might be the same exact thing, but it's still beautiful.
Some days Danilo is Don Quixote and Mac is Sancho Panza, but sometimes they flip roles, and it is this dualistic dialectic dynamic as they proceed through their episodes that really informs their role in 21st century literature during the mid 2020s.
As Zizek would say, the Hegelian dialectical nature of our podcast really lends itself to recreating the capital T, capital Q, the Quixote, I think. Yes, that is good stuff.
And we'll end this episode, and what will follow will be the full pirated audiobook of Don Quixote.
Oh my God.
So please listen to that.
That is such a funny idea.
People download this episode, and they're like, 24 hours.
Oh my God.
Oh, do you know what would be even better? If it's a full... it's just a full reading of the Pierre Menard story.
Well, yeah, of course, the Quixote. I don't want this dreck.
All right. Well, thank you for listening, everyone. I hope you will all go forth and write your own Quixote that we can deliberate and talk about. And I think that would be much more interesting and worthwhile than whatever ChatGPT is doing. If you like the show and want to reach out, you can email us at hardcoverhooligans.com. You can follow us on social media, and please leave a funny review. Maybe copy and paste the text of Don Quixote or Borges' Wikipedia page into a review. That'd be really fun.
That would be really
Please
good
do that,
if
someone.
Just,
if we do it ourselves, that's cringe. But if you do it,
it
is very interesting. It's very compelling.
Yeah, because you bring your own thoughts to it, you know?
When you copy and paste, it's like it's your fingers, and where else have those fingers been, you know? When a farmer's hands copy and paste a text, it is so much. It's infinitely richer than when a scholar's hands copy and paste the text. It's beautiful.
Anyway, stay... What should it be here? Stay,
I don't know.
I hope... Stay... being from...
Maybe we should leave it there.
Yeah, there is none. You can fill it in yourself, and it will be just as important as whatever I was going to say.
And that's beautiful. Pierre Menard, author of The Quixote, by McIntyre Godwin and Danilo Luchko. The visible oeuvre left by this novelist can be easily and briefly enumerated. Unpardonable, therefore, are the omissions and additions perpetrated by Madame Henri Bochelier in a deceitful catalogue that a certain newspaper, whose Protestant leanings are surely no secret, has been so inconsiderate as to inflict upon that newspaper's deplorable readers, few and Calvinists, if not Masonic and circumcised, though they be. Menard's true friends have greeted that catalogue with alarm, and even with a degree of sadness. One might note that only yesterday were we gathered before his marmoreal place of rest, among the dreary cypresses, and already error is attempting to tarnish his bright memory. Most decidedly, a brief rectification is imperative. I am aware that it is easy enough to call my own scant authority into question. I hope, nonetheless, that I shall not be prohibited from mentioning two high testimonials. The Baroness de Barcourt, at whose unforgettable vendredi I had the honor to meet the mourned-for poet, has been so kind as to approve the lines that follow. Likewise, the Countess de Bagnoregio, one of the rarest and most cultured spirits of the Principality of Monaco, now of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, following her recent marriage to the international philanthropist Simon Couch, a man, it grieves me to say, vilified and slandered by the victims of his disinterested operations, has sacrificed to truth and to death, as she herself has phrased it, the noble reserve that is the mark of her distinction, and, in an open letter published in the magazine Lux, bestows upon me her blessing. Those commendations are sufficient, I should think. I have said that the visible product of Menard's pen is easily enumerated. Having examined his personal files with greatest care, I have established that his body of work consists of the following pieces. A symbolist sonnet that appeared twice, with variants, in the review La Conque in the numbers for March and October 1899. B. A monograph on the possibility of constructing a poetic vocabulary from concepts that are neither synonyms nor periphrastatic locutions for the concepts that inform common speech, but are rather ideal objects created by convention essentially for the needs of poetry. Nîmes, 1901. C. A monograph on certain connections or affinities between the philosophies of Descartes, Leibniz, and John Wilkins. Nîmes, 1903. D. A monograph on Leibniz Characteristica Universalis. Nîmes, 1904. E. A technical article on the possibility of enriching the game of chess by eliminating one of the rook's pawns. Menard proposes, recommends, debates, and finally rejects this innovation. F. A monograph on Raymond Lull's Ars Magna Generalis, Nîmes, 1906. G. A translation with introduction and notes of Ruy López de Segura's Libro de la Invención Revelar y Arte del Juego del Ajedrez, Paris, 1907. H. Drafts of a monograph on George Boole's Symbolic Logic. I. A study of the essential metrical rules of French prose, illustrated with examples taken from Saint-Simon, Revue des Langues Romandes, Montpellier, October, 1909. J. A reply to Luc Durtin, who had countered no such rules existed, illustrated with examples taken from Luc Durtin, Revue des Langues Romandes, Montpellier, December, 1909. K. A manuscript translation of Quevedo's Aguja de Navegar Cultos, titled La Boussole des Précieux. L. A foreword to the catalogue of an exhibit of lithographs by Carolus Hauercade, Nîmes, 1914. M. A work entitled Les Problèmes d'un Problème, Paris, 1917, which discusses in chronological order the solutions to a famous problem of Achilles and the tortoise. 2 editions of this work have so far appeared. The second bears an epigraph consisting of Leibniz's advice, Ne craignez point, monsieur, la tortue, and brings up to date the chapters devoted to Russell and Descartes. N. A dogged analysis of the syntactical habits of Toulet, NRF, March 1921. Menard, I recall, affirmed that censure and praise were sentimental operations that bore not the slightest resemblance to criticism. O. A transposition into Alexandrians of Paul Valéry's Cimetière Marin, NRF, January 1928. P. A diatribe against Paul Valéry in Jacques Reboul's Feuille pour la suppression de la réalité, which diatribe, I might add, parenthetically states the exact reverse of Menard's true opinion of Valéry. Valéry understood this, and the two men's friendship was never imperiled. Q. A, quote, definition of the Countess of de Bagnoregio in the, quote, triumphant volume. That phrase is that of another contributor, Gabriele D'Annunzio, published each year by that lady to rectify the inevitable biases of the popular press and to present to the world and all of Italy a true picture of her person, which was so exposed, by reason of her beauty and her bearing, to erroneous and or hasty interpretations. R. A cycle of admirable sonnets dedicated to the Baroness Bacour, 1934. S. A handwritten list of lines of poetry that owe their excellence to punctuation. This is the full extent, save for a few vague sonnets of occasion destined for Madame Henri Bachelier's hospitable or greedy album des souvenirs, of the visible life work of Pierre Menard, in proper chronological order. I shall turn now to the other, the subterranean, the interminably heroic production, the oeuvre non parée, the oeuvre that must remain for our human limitations, unfinished. This work, perhaps the most significant writing of our time, consists of the 9th and 38 chapters of Part 1 of Don Quixote and a fragment of Chapter 22. I know that such a claim is on the face of it absurd, justifying that absurdity shall be the principal object of this note. 2 texts of distinctly unequal value inspired the undertaking. One was that philological fragment by Novalis, number 2005 in the Dresden edition to be precise, which outlines the notion of total identification with a given author. The other was one of those parasitic books that set Christ on a boulevard, Hamlet on La Canebière, or Don Quixote on Wall Street. Like every man of taste, Menard abominated those pointless travesties, which Menard would say were good for nothing but occasioning a plebeian delight in anachronism, or, worse yet, captivating us with the elementary notion that all times and places are the same, or are different. It might be more interesting, he thought, though of contradictory and superficial execution, to attempt what Daudet had so famously suggested, conjoin in a single figure, Tartarin say, both the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote and his squire. Those who have insinuated that Menard devoted his life to writing a contemporary Quixote besmirch his illustrious memory. Pierre Menard did not want to compose another Quixote, which surely is easy enough. He wanted to compose the Quixote. Nor, surely, need one be obliged to note that his goal was never a mechanical transcription of the original. He had no intention of copying it. His admirable ambition was to produce a number of pages which coincided, word for word and line for line, with those of Miguel de Cervantes. My purpose is merely astonishing, he wrote to me on September 30th, 1934, from Bayonne. The final term of a theological and metaphysical proof, the world around us, or God, or chance, or universal forms, is no more final, no more uncommon than my revealed novel. The sole difference is that philosophers publish pleasant volumes containing the intermediate stages of their work, while I am resolved to suppress those stages of my own. And indeed, there is not a single draft to bear witness to that years-long labor. Initially, Menard's method was to be relatively simple. Learn Spanish, return to Catholicism, fight against the Moor or Turk, forget the history of Europe from 1602 to 1918, be Miguel de Cervantes. Pierre Menard weighed that course. I know he thoroughly mastered 17th century Castilian, but he discarded it as too easy. Too impossible, rather, the reader will say. Quite so. But the undertaking was impossible from the outset, and of all the impossible ways of bringing it about, this was the least interesting. To be a popular novelist of the 17th century in the 20th seemed to Menard to be a diminution. Being somehow Cervantes and arriving thereby at the Quixote, that looked to Menard less challenging, and therefore less interesting, than continuing to be Pierre Menard and coming to the Quixote through the experiences of Pierre Menard. It was that conviction, by the way, that obliged him to leave out the autobiographical foreword to part 2 of the novel, including the prologue would have meant creating another character, quote, Cervantes, and also presenting Quixote through that character's eyes, not Pierre Menard's. Menard, of course, spurned that easy solution. The task I have undertaken is not, in essence, difficult, I read at another place in that letter. If I could just be immortal, I could do it. Shall I confess that I often imagined that he did complete it, and that I read the Quixote, the entire Quixote, as if Menard had conceived it. A few nights ago, as I was leafing through chapter 26, never attempted by Menard, I recognized our friend's style, could almost hear his voice in the marvelous phrase, the nymphs of the rivers, the moist and grieving echo. That wonderfully effective linking of one adjective of emotion with another of physical description brought to my mind a line from Shakespeare, which I recall we discussed one afternoon, where malignant and turbaned Turk. Why the Quixote, my reader may ask? That choice, made by a Spaniard, would not have been incomprehensible, but it no doubt is so when made by a symboliste from Nîmes, a devotee essentially of Poe, who begat Baudelaire, who begat Mallarmé, who begat Valery, who begat Monsieur Edmond Teste. The letter above throws some light on this point. The Quixote, explains Menard, deeply interests me, but does not seem to me, comment dirais-je, inevitable. I cannot imagine the universe without Poe's ejaculation, "Ah, bear in mind this garden was enchanted," or "the bateau ivre," or "the ancient mariner," but I know myself able to imagine it without the Quixote. I am speaking, of course, of my personal ability, not of the historical resonance of those works. The Quixote is a contingent work. The Quixote is not necessary. I can premeditate committing it to writing, as it were. I can write it, without falling into a tautology. At the age of 12 or 13, I read it, perhaps cover to cover, I cannot recall. Since then, I have carefully reread certain chapters, those which, at least for the moment, I shall not attempt. I have also glanced at the interludes, the comedies, the Galatea, the exemplary novels, the undoubtedly laborious Travail of Persile and Sigismunda, and the poetic Voyage to Parnassus. My general recollection of the Quixote, simplified by forgetfulness and indifference, might well be the equivalent of the vague foreshadowing of a yet unwritten book. Given that image, which no one can in good conscience deny me, my problem is, without a shadow of a doubt, much more difficult than Cervantes. My obliging predecessor did not spurn the collaboration of chance. His method of composition for the immortal book was a bit à la diable, and he was often swept along by the inertia of the language and the imagination. I have assumed the mysterious obligation to reconstruct, word for word, the novel that for him was spontaneous. This game of solitaire I played is governed by two polar rules. The first allows me to try out formal or psychological variants. The second forces me to sacrifice them to the original text and to come by irrefutable arguments to those eradications. In addition to the first two artificial constraints, there is another inherent to the project. Composing the Quixote in the early 17th century was a reasonable, necessary, perhaps even inevitable undertaking. In the early 20th, it is virtually impossible. Not for nothing have 300 years elapsed, freighted by the most complex events. Among those events, to mention but one, is the Quixote itself. In spite of those three obstacles, Menard's fragmentary Quixote is more subtle than Cervantes. Cervantes crudely juxtaposes the humble provincial reality of his country against the fantasies of the romance, while Menard chooses his, quote, reality, the land of Carmen during the century that saw the Battle of Lepanto and the plays of Lope de Vega. What burlesque brushstrokes of local color that choice would have inspired in a Maurice Barré or a Rodriguez Larreta. Yet Menard, with perfect naturalness, avoids them. In his work, there are no gypsy goings-on or conquistadors or mystics or Philip II or autos da fe. He ignores, overlooks, or banishes local color. That disdain posits a new meaning for the, quote, historical novel. That disdain condemns Salambo with no possibility of appeal. No less amazement visits one when the chapters are considered in isolation. As an example, let us look at Part 1, Chapter 38, which treats of the curious discourse that Don Quixote made on the subject of arms and letters. It is a matter of common knowledge that in that chapter, Don Quixote, like Quevedo in the analogous and later passage in La Hora de Todos, comes down against letters and in favor of arms. Cervantes was an old soldier. From him, the verdict is understandable. But that Pierre Menard's Don Quixote, a contemporary of La Trahison de Clerc and Bertrand Russell, should repeat those cloudy sophistries. Madame Bachelier sees in them an admirable, typical, subordination of the author to the psychology of the hero. Others, lacking all perspicacity, see them as a transcription of the Quixote, the Baroness de Barcourt as influenced by Nietzsche. To that third interpretation, which I consider irrefutable, I am not certain I dare to add a fourth, though it agrees very well with the most divine modesty of Pierre Menard, his resigned or ironic habit of putting forth ideas that were the exact opposite of those he actually held. We should recall that diatribe against Paul Valéry in the ephemeral surrealist journal edited by Jacques Raboul. The Cervantes text and the Menard text are verbally identical, but the second is almost infinitely richer, more ambiguous, his detractors will say, but ambiguity is richness. It is a revelation to compare the Don Quixote of Pierre Menard with that of Miguel de Cervantes. Cervantes, for example, wrote the following, Part 1, Chapter 9. Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and the future's counselor. This catalogue of attributes, written in the 17th century and written by the ingenious layman Miguel de Cervantes, is mere rhetorical praise of history. Menard, on the other hand, writes, Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and the future's counselor. History, the mother of truth. The idea is staggering. Menard, a contemporary of William James, defines history not as delving into reality, but as the very fount of reality. Historical truth for Menard is not what happened, it is what we believe happened. The final phrases, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future's counselor, are brazenly pragmatic. The contrast in styles is equally striking. The archaic style of Menard, who is, in addition, not a native speaker of the language in which he writes, is somewhat affected. Not so the style of his precursor, who employs the Spanish of his time with complete naturalness. There is no intellectual exercise that is not ultimately pointless. A philosophical doctrine is, at first, a plausible description of the universe. The years go by, and it is a mere chapter, if not a paragraph or a proper noun, in the history of philosophy. In literature, that falling by the wayside, that loss of relevance, is even better known. The Quixote, Menard remarked, was the first and foremost a pleasant book. It is now an occasion for patriotic toasts, grammatical arrogance, obscene deluxe editions. Fame is a form, perhaps the worst form, of incomprehension. Those nihilistic observations were not new. What was remarkable was the decision that Pierre Menard derived from them. He resolved to anticipate the vanity that awaits all the labors of mankind. He undertook the task of infinite complexity, a task futile from the outset. He dedicated his scruples and his nights lit by midnight oil to repeating in a foreign tongue a book that already existed. His drafts were endless. He stubbornly corrected, and he ripped up thousands of handwritten pages. He would allow no one to see them, and took care they not survive him. In vain I have attempted to reconstruct them. I reflected that it is legitimate to see the final Quixote as a kind of palimpsest, in which the traces, faint but not indecipherable, of our friend's previous texts must shine through. Unfortunately, only a second Pierre Menard, reversing the labors of the first, would be able to exhume and revive those Troys. Thinking, meditating, imagining, he also wrote to me, are not anomalous acts. They are the normal respiration of the intelligence. To glorify the occasional exercise of that function, to treasure beyond price ancient and foreign thoughts, to recall with incredulous awe that some Doctor Universalis thought, is to confess our own languor, our own barbarie. Every man should be capable of all ideas, and I believe that in the future he shall be. Menard has, perhaps unwittingly, enriched the slow and rudimentary art of reading by means of a new technique, the technique of deliberate anachronism and fallacious attribution. That technique, requiring infinite patience and concentration, encourages us to read the Odyssey as though it came after the Aeneid, to read Madame Henri Bachelier's Le Jardin des Centaures as though it were written by Madame Henri Bachelier. This technique fills the calmest books with adventure, attributing the Imitatio Christi to Louise Ferdinand Céline or James Joyce. Is that not sufficient renovation of those faint spiritual admonitions?